Thanks for those kind words. It's very nice to be here with you all. Some familiar faces that I've met before, some not so familiar, but it's good to be here. Yeah, what I want to do in these talks today is to share some insights from, well, for these rapidly changing times, about how science and spirituality seem to me, anyway, to be on a converging path. Um, and in this first talk, I'm going to look at the science aspect around issues of consciousness and interconnectedness and oneness. And all these talks are going to be illustrated. So I'm now going to share my screen, get that working properly. Here we go. Right, it should be coming up in a second. So the PowerPoint's going to be going in the background, and I magically appear at the bottom of the PowerPoint. But before I was a vicar, as Kate said, I was a science teacher, and bringing those two parts of my life together has always been part of my spiritual path. When I was teaching, I taught an awful lot of people, an awful lot of students, the kind of simple version of the nature of matter. Each atom being made up of a nucleus with electrons whizzing around it in orbit, which I'm sure we all learned when we were at school. I also taught about electricity being a movement of free electrons in metal. And neither of those are strictly true. Yet at the same time as I was teaching this, I was aware of this deeper level of stuff that was being discovered about elementary particles, the quarks, the leptons, the gluons, muons, bosons. They've got wonderful names. And in that kind of level of reality, everything was actually tiny vortices of energy, energy of different frequencies and different wavelengths, not solid at all. And it now appears that nothing is actually solid as such. It's all really interlaced patterns of energy, which creates force fields. And it's those force fields that give us the feeling of different textures to our sense of touch. Our eyes receive the reflected light from these force fields and send information to our brain, and our consciousness then forms that information into a mental image. So, for instance, a table is seen, pictured in our minds as something hard, brown, and made of wood, not just an incredibly complicated interlacing of energies and forces held in a pattern that came from the form of an oak tree. We don't see those forces and energies that are actually the real table. We just see and feel the shape interpreted by our mind. Now, equally, a flower image is formed in our minds from the reflected light of different frequencies. The light's reflected off those force fields that make up the flower according to the patterns of those minute vortices of energies that are its form. Our eyes convert that light into an electrochemical message to the brain, which our consciousness then interprets to create color and shape out of those light frequencies and give it a label, of course, a daisy or a buttercup. The brain is the receptor and filter mechanism for our consciousness. So slowly there's been a kind of downward trickle from the scientific world, which says that we inhabit an existence which is actually composed of energetic information fields, not solid matter. But what's happening now is that some scientists are beginning to say that matter emerges from mind or consciousness and not the other way around. It's a big change that's going on. What we've learnt in our upbringing is that, conventional science takes the perspective of what they call upward causation, which says that matter is the building block of all things, and life and mind and consciousness arise from those building blocks as they get ever more complex. So in the beginning, atoms combined to form molecules, and those reacted in ever more intricate ways until eventually organic life emerged, and gradually over the eons it became increasingly complex. Brain tissue developed to coordinate all the living matter. Consciousness emerged within the evolved brain. That's the conventional view, which we're very familiar with. It's sort of a backdrop, if you like, to Western society. But there's a new paradigm that's now emerging in scientific thought. And it's come from the world of quantum science, that strange minuscule world where subatomic particles behave in ways that defy conventional science and thought. And the new paradigm, the new worldview says that the prime source in the universe is not matter, but consciousness. We're all part of that consciousness, and the world of matter arises from the collapse of quantum energy waves into individual particles. And it's brought about by the effect of consciousness on those energy waves. And consciousness brings matter into being. So in this world of quantum mechanics, well, subatomic particles aren't really particles at all. They exist as a wave of potential, a sort of smeared out over all space. And an electron, for instance, doesn't exist in any one location. There's a wave of possible locations, possible existences. And what brings out the actuality of an electron from all the potential is being observed. Observation, of course, implies consciousness, which brings about, and it's the consciousness that brings about the reality of matter. This is what quantum science is telling us. Now, that discovery is what has brought about, or is bringing about, a turnaround in some scientific thought. Although, it was discovered over 80 years ago. But basically, this quantum insight says that if there's no consciousness in the beginning, then particles would never have come into the existence. The material world that we live in and are part of wouldn't exist. So in this new understanding, it's consciousness that is the starting point. Consciousness is prime. It's mind before matter. And hence the title of this day of talks, Mind Melds Matter and Spirit. Put simply, this universe doesn't seem to exist without a perceiver of the universe. So in that view, consciousness is the underlying matrix in which everything is held. Now, this is revolutionary stuff. And of course, with any thought, any new thought, there's considerable resistance to it. So many scientists stuck in the rational, materialistic paradigm of science, but they call it, woo-woo science. But actually, that's simply a way of dismissing it so that they don't have to consider what is a perfectly respectable theory and deserves proper attention. There are many scientists now who are investigating it. And the secret of good science, I believe, is to have an open mind. In the new view, consciousness is no longer seen as a phenomenon popping out of the brain, but as the ground of being, in which all material possibilities, including the brain, are held in potential. Of course, the ground of being is a term that's been used in Christianity for many years, and it pops up in Hinduism and Taoism and other religious traditions as a description of the divine. Basically, it's the idea of a divine presence from whom this reality emanates and in whom it is sustained. Now, it's taken 100 years for the realization to dawn in scientific circles that this divine matrix, this universal consciousness, could be a reality. Scientists have really got nowhere in describing or trying to find out a theory of what consciousness is. It's as if it lies outside the realm of material reality. It doesn't fit with the current materialistic science as we know it. But one aspect of physics, quantum physics, is saying that there is a universal field of consciousness which acts on the energetic information fields to bring matter into reality as we know it. And this consciousness is what holds everything in being, sustains the whole thing. The entire universe is understood as a projection of consciousness. This is the idea of a holographic universe. So everything in this reality has a form of consciousness in order that it can exist. From atom to planet, it's all part of the one consciousness. Every individual atom, every person, or every planet will have its own measure of a fundamental consciousness which causes it to be, causes it to exist. Now, the idea that reality as we see it is actually not how it is at all, it's a huge leap for most people to take on board. It's as much of a shift for many scientists as it is for us ordinary folks. It actually became easier for me to understand as I gained a deeper understanding of theology and the perennial wisdom teachings that have come down through the ages. I could see from these teachings that there's an underlying information pattern, if you like, a divine matrix which holds everything in being. And science is beginning to think along the same lines. I taught science for 13 years, only in a secondary school. I wasn't a scientist as such. I've been an Anglican priest for many more years, and I did long to see the day when there would be scientific theories that could actually tie together science and spirituality, because I've never really seen them as separate. But I doubted whether it would ever happen and be accepted. But we're now at the beginning of that process, and this new story is emerging. A story of the acceptance that science and spirituality are not opposing worldviews. They're two sides of the same coin. I firmly believe that science and religion are converging, and this recent cutting-edge science seems to be indicating the same. And to me, that's very exciting. So let's just look a little bit deeper at what's happening in science. No mathematical equations or anything like that, I promise you. In recent years, several scientific writers have presented the viewpoint that the universe is a cosmic hologram, an intricately interconnected system in a series of nested hierarchies of energy, repeating patterns with the same essence of information running through. Think for a moment about those little Russian dolls, each one containing a smaller version, the patterns repeated at all levels, going up and coming down. Every doll is part of a bigger one and also contains a smaller one. The universe consists of the same pattern at different levels, nested hierarchies, like the dolls. Or do you remember a poem about fleas? It goes like this: big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them. Big fleas and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so on ad infinitum. And the great fleas themselves in turn have greater fleas to go on, while these again have greater still, and so on. And that in a way is the representation of the principle of as above, so below. From recent scientific discoveries, it appears that there are repeated patterns at all levels of existence in this physical world. From a brain cell to the universe, we see the same underlying patterns appearing. And this developing view says that beyond energy, there's an informational domain out of which all reality is derived. The entire universe is a projection emanating from that one informational domain, which holds the pattern for all existence. And these informational patterns are repeated at all levels, up and down. And out of the complexity we see around us, it means actually there's an intrinsic simplicity and an innate wholeness and oneness to our universe. Now, some of the evidence for this is that the same patterns are found in a variety of natural phenomena. For instance, fractals are the pattern that can be seen in all sorts of natural structures. For example, as in this picture, underlying the irregularity of the coastline. Fractals patterns can be seen also in ice crystals, forming all those beautiful individual crystals of ice. But fractals are also seen in the complexity of entire weather systems. They're also seen in things like the corrosion patterns of metals, and in the crystalline structures of superconductors, and also in the solar wind, and in the structure of Saturn's rings. Now, I don't know the science of all this. I'm just reading what I'm told in books. But it's amazing when you think that the same patterns occur in all these different things. Even galaxies apparently cluster in fractal patterns. And even more astonishing, I think, is that apparently cities grow in the same way that galaxies form, the same pattern, the same patterns at all scales of existence, whether it's natural or man-made. Pattern underlies it. Another remarkable discovery is that the same patterns can be seen in the power frequency of earthquakes and the power law of conflicts and wars. It seems amazing that the same patterns are there throughout the universe, unless there is some form of mind or consciousness bringing it all into being. These last two slides have been provided by Jude Currivan, and there's a lot of examples of these repetition of these sorts of patterns in her book, The Cosmic Hologram, where she sees information at the center of creation. So gradually, there is a new way of seeing this physical plane on which we dwell. And it's moving us on from the materialistic viewpoint, which says that matter is all there is, and consciousness pops out of the brain when the brain is developed enough. The new story says that consciousness or mind has to exist before matter. Now, the other book I mentioned earlier, Mind Before Matter, is a collection of essays by scientists from different disciplines, all saying that consciousness has to come first. One of the contributors to it is Professor Amit Goswami, and he's been saying for years that consciousness is the ground of being. He's a professor of quantum physics. He's saying that consciousness is the ground of being from which everything materializes at the quantum level, and that there is only one universal consciousness, and that we all have a sort of individuated portion of it, if you like. Now, before Amit Goswami, a lot of other people have been saying this. Famous scientists have said it. Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger said, consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, but consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. Another grandfather of the new physics, Arthur Eddington, said the stuff of the universe is mind stuff. And an astrophysicist, Eric Jansch, said God is not the creator, but the mind of the universe. Now, as I said earlier, basically scientists can't really form a theory of consciousness at the moment. They haven't got the understanding of how electrochemical signals entering the brain give rise to an experience of smell or taste or sight, let alone emotions of love or hate or mathematical thought or philosophical reasoning. There's no inkling of how these things come about from purely physical intake from via the eyes or the senses. It is as if consciousness exists outside the known laws of the universe and reality as we know it. And maybe it will be the next scientific breakthrough that starts to join up some of these dots. And I think what all this is saying is that the material world as we know it stems or emanates from a deeper level of information, like universal mind. And all material matter has its origin in mind or consciousness. And from a scientific view, the whole universe is the outpicturing of one universal informational domain, or mind, or cosmic consciousness. Jude Currivan puts it like this in her book. She says, "We are each individuated microcosms of the holographic intelligence of our universe, and ultimately the infinite and eternal mind of the cosmos." I'll read that again. "We are each individuated microcosms of the holographic intelligence of our universe, and ultimately of the infinite and eternal mind of the cosmos." So from this emerging scientific viewpoint, oneness is really what we are. We come from the ground of being, held in a matrix of consciousness. Now, I hope that's not been too much for folks to take in this first talk. It's a bit of a mind-blowing thing, but it's important to establish this idea that this new emerging science is actually talking the language of spirituality, albeit in its own words and terminology. So thank you. I'm going to stop this one there.